Chapter 28 of Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Mark Frettleby has a visitor. According to the copybooks of our youth, procrastination is the thief of time. Now, Brian found the truth of this. He had been in town almost a week, but he had not yet been to see Calton. Each morning, or something very near it, he set out, determined to go direct to Chancery Lane, but he never arrived there. He had returned to his lodgings in East Melbourne, and had passed his time either in the house or in the garden. When perhaps business connected with the sale of his station compelled his presence in town, he drove straight there and back. Curiously enough, he shrank from meeting any of his friends. He felt keenly his recent position in the prisoner's dock, and even when walking by the Yarra, as he frequently did, he was conscious of an uneasy feeling, a feeling that he was an object of curiosity, and that people turned to look at him out of a morbid desire to see one who had been so nearly hanged for murder. As soon as his station should be sold and he married to Madge, he determined to leave Australia, and never set foot on it again. But until he could leave the place he would see no one, nor would he mix with his former friends, so great was his dread of being stared at. Mrs. Sampson, who had welcomed him back with shrill exclamations of delight, was loud in her expressions of disapproval as to the way he was shutting himself up. "Your eyes bein' hollow," said the sympathising Cricket, "it is nat'ral it's its want of air, which my husband's uncle, being a druggist, and well to do, in Collingwood, sees how a want of oxygen, being a French name, as he called the atmosphere, were fearful for pulling people down, and making 'em go off their food, which you hardly eats anything, and not being a butterfly it's expected as your appetite would be larger." "Oh, I'm all right," said Brian, absently lighting a cigarette, and only half listening to his landlady's garrulous chatter; "but if anyone calls, tell them I'm not in. I don't want to be bothered by visitors." "Bein' as wise a thing as Solomon ever said," answered Mrs. Sampson, energetically, "which no doubt he was in good health when seein' the Queen of Sheber, as necessary when anyone calls, and not feelin' disposed to speak, which I'm often that way myself on occasions, my spirits bein' low, as I've heard soda water to have that effect on 'em, which you takes it with a dash of brandy, though to be sure that might be the cause of your want of life, and drat that bell," she finished, hurrying out of the room as the front door bell sounded, "which my legs is a givin' way under me through bein' overworked." Meanwhile, Brian sat and smoked contentedly, much relieved by the departure of Mrs. Sampson, with her constant chatter, but he soon heard her mount the stairs again, and she entered the room with a telegram, which she handed to her lodger. "'Opin' it don't contain bad news," she said as she retreated to the door again, "which I don't like 'em havin' had a shock in early life, through one havin' come unexpected, as my uncle's grandfather were dead, havin' perished of consumption, our family all being disposed to the disease. And now, if you'll excuse me, sir, I'll get to my dinner, bein' in the 'abit of taking my meals reg'lar, and I studies my inside carefully, bein' easily upset, through which I never could be a sailor." Mrs. Sampson, having at last exhausted herself, went out of the room, and crackled loudly down the stairs, leaving Brian to read his telegram. He tore open the envelope and found the message was from Madge, to say that they had returned, and to ask him to dine with them that evening. Fitzgerald folded up the telegram, then, rising from his seat, he walked moodily up and down the room with his hands in his pockets. "So he is there," said the young man aloud, "and I shall have to meet him and shake hands with him, knowing all the time what he is. If it were not for Madge I'd leave this place at once, but after the way she stood by me in my trouble, I should be a coward if I did so." It was as Madge had predicted. Her father was unable to stay long in one place, and had come back to Melbourne a week after Brian had arrived. The pleasant party at the station was broken up, and, like the graves of a household, the guests were scattered far and wide. Peterson had left for New Zealand en route for the wonders of the hot lakes, and the old colonist was about to start for England in order to refresh his boyish memories. Mr. and Mrs. Rolleston had come back to Melbourne, where the wretched Felix was compelled once more to plunge into politics, and Dr. Chinston had resumed his usual routine of fees and patients. Madge was glad to be back in Melbourne again, as now that her health was restored she craved for the excitement of town life. It was now more than 3 months since the murder, and the 9 days' wonder was a thing of the past. The possibility of a war with Russia was the one absorbing topic of the hour, and the colonists were busy preparing for the attack of a possible enemy. As the Spanish kings had drawn their treasures from Mexico and Peru, so might the White Czar lay violent hands on the golden stores of Australia, But here there were no uncultured savages to face, but the sons and grandsons of men who had dimmed the glories of the Russian arms at Alma and Balaclava. So in the midst of stormy rumours of wars the tragic fate of Oliver Whyte was quite forgotten. After the trial, everyone, including the detective office, had given up the matter, and mentally relegated it to the list of undiscovered crimes. In spite of the utmost vigilance, nothing new had been discovered, and it seemed likely that the assassin of Oliver Whyte would remain a free man. There were only two people in Melbourne who still held the contrary opinion, and they were Calton and Kilsip. Both these men had sworn to discover this unknown murderer, who struck his cowardly blow in the dark, and, though there seemed no possible chance of success, yet they worked on. Kilsip suspected Roger Moreland, the boon companion of the dead man, but his suspicions were vague and uncertain, and there seemed little hope of verifying them. The barrister did not as yet suspect any particular person, though the deathbed confession of Mother Guttersnipe had thrown a new light on the subject, but he thought that when Fitzgerald told him the secret which Rosanna Moore had confided to his keeping, the real murderer would soon be discovered, or at least some clue would be found that would lead to his detection. So, as the matter stood at the time of Mark Frettleby's return to Melbourne, Mr. Calton was waiting for Fitzgerald's confession before making a move, while Kilsip worked stealthily in the dark, searching for evidence against Moreland. On receiving Madge's telegram, Brian determined to go down in the evening, but not to dinner, so he sent a reply to Madge to that effect. He did not want to meet Mark Frettleby, but did not, of course, tell this to Madge, so she had her dinner by herself, as her father had gone to his club, and the time of his return was uncertain. After dinner, she wrapped a light cloak round her, and repaired to the verandah to wait for her lover. The garden looked charming in the moonlight, with the black, dense cypress trees standing up against the sky, and the great fountain splashing cool and silvery. There was a heavily foliaged oak by the gate, and she strolled down the path, and stood under it in the shadow, listening to the whisper and rustle of its multitudinous leaves. It is curious the unearthly glamour which moonlight seems to throw over everything, and though Madge knew every flower, tree, and shrub in the garden, yet they all looked weird and fantastical in the cold white light. She went up to the fountain, and, seating herself on the edge, amused herself by dipping her hand into the chilly water, and letting it fall, like silver rain, back into the basin. Then she heard the iron gate open and shut with a clash, and, springing to her feet, saw someone coming up the path in a light coat and soft, wide-awake hat. "Oh, it's you at last, Brian!" she cried, as she ran down the path to meet him. "Why did you not come before?" "Not being Brian, I can't say," answered her father's voice. Madge burst out laughing. "What an absurd mistake!" she cried. "Why, I thought you were Brian." "Indeed!" "Yes, in that hat and coat I couldn't tell the difference in the moonlight." "Oh!" said her father with a laugh, pushing his hat back. "Moonlight is necessary to complete the spell, I suppose." "Of course," answered his daughter. "If there were no moonlight, alas for lovers!" "Alas, indeed!" echoed her father. "They would become as extinct as the moa. But where are your eyes, Puss, when you take an old man like me for your gay young Lochinvar?" "Well, really, papa," answered Madge deprecatingly, "you do look so like him in that coat and hat that I could not tell the difference till you spoke." "Nonsense, child," said Frettleby roughly. "You are fanciful." And turning on his heel, he walked rapidly towards the house, leaving Madge staring after him in astonishment, as well she might, for her father had never spoken to her so roughly before. Wondering at the cause of his sudden anger, she stood spellbound, until there came a step behind her, and a soft low whistle. She turned with a scream, and saw Brian smiling at her. "Oh, it's you," she said with a pout, as he caught her in his arms and kissed her. "Only me," said Brian ungrammatically. "Disappointing, isn't it?" "Oh, fearfully," answered the girl with a gay laugh, as arm in arm they walked towards the house. "But do you know I made such a curious mistake just now? I thought papa was you." "How strange!" said Brian absently, for indeed he was admiring her charming face, which looked so pure and sweet in the moonlight. "Yes, wasn't it?" she replied. "He had on a light coat and a soft hat, just like you wear sometimes, and as you are both the same height, I took you for one another." Brian did not answer, but there was a cold feeling at his heart as he saw a possibility of his worst suspicions being confirmed, for just at that moment there came into his mind the curious coincidence of the man who got into the hansom cab being dressed similarly to himself. What if— "Nonsense," he said aloud, rousing himself out of the train of thought the resemblance had suggested. "I'm sure it isn't," said Madge, who had been talking about something else for the last 5 minutes. "You are a very rude young man." "I beg your pardon," said Brian, waking up. "You were saying—" "That the horse is the most noble of all animals. Exactly." I don't understand.